Virgil Exner was fired as Chrysler's styling leader in 1962 after the company's introductory models really flopped in the marketplace. In particular, the Plymouth Valiant-like styling and the Dodge that we'll just call homely really were not successes at all. And after that, Chrysler leadership knew that it had to go in a new direction. To that point, Chrysler's new president, Lynn Townsend, took a call from Ford's styling chief, George Walker, to talk more about Elwood Engel as a potential successor to Exner. Both Walker and his then underling Engel were both upset that Ford management had chosen someone other than Engel or Joe Oros to succeed Walker. More specifically, Ford management chose Gene Bourdonnais, and that just didn't sit well with either outgoing styling chief George Walker or either of his deputies. In any case, Chrysler's president, Lynn Townsend, took a call from George Walker, where Walker apparently talked a lot about how he thought Engel could be the next styling leader at Chrysler, especially given that Exner was not having much success. And thus a deal was brokered to bring Engel over to Chrysler. By the time Engel had arrived, it was too late to really do anything about the 1963 models. They had been well on their way. And Engel couldn't do too much with the 1964s either, although he absolutely abhorred the sloping rear decks on the Chryslers of the era and apparently ordered mini fins put on the vehicle to kind of disguise the fact that the deck lid would slope downward. So for 1965, when Chrysler management approved enough expense to create new tooling for all new vehicles, Engel had his first chance to really design what he thought should be the new Chrysler. Some of the look associated with this 1965 Chrysler was actually previewed on the previous model year's 1964 Imperial. It took more than a few styling cues from the 61 Continental, and of course it would, because that was one of the vehicles that Engel was heavily involved in when he was at Ford Motor Company, and candidly one of his selling points from a design standpoint. But in any event, Engel really got a chance to execute the Chryslers as he wanted for the 1965 model year. And just to show how different his vision was from Virgil Exner's, let's take a look at a few clay models that were done in the advanced studios for potential 65 models under Virgil Exner. Take a look at this one here, this first one with wraparound front and rear glass. I don't think I've ever seen a car like this, with a very distinctive B pillar, no C pillar, no A pillar, and then you have a pillar in the middle of the rear window. A very bizarre design, I guess, overall. And no tail fins on this. But you do notice the front is a little bit early 1960s Dodge Dart-esque. Regardless, this is a controversial, let's say, car to say the least. I don't know what to even say to describe it. I do like the torpedo-like front end there that terminates in the round headlamp, and it kind of has this interesting scalloped formation, I guess, where it takes part of the body away from itself, and you have these rather interesting air extractors behind the front wheel, kind of like shark's gills, I guess. But I'll call it a confused design. I don't know that anybody would have bought that. And here's another proposal from Virgil Exner Studios before he departed. Take a look at this wonky thing. You notice you still have those crazy pillars. I guess Exner was trying to get the roof to look like it was more of a floating roof, and did so by obstructing your vision in the rear and to the side. Not necessarily a great idea. This one is, I would say, more restrained, though, than the previous model. It does have an interesting deck lid and kind of Gillette electric razor-y rear end. I don't know how else to describe it, with the license plate inset in there. The front end is kind of conventional with oversized bumper guards, especially for the time period. I think it's safe to say that these vehicles would not have been successful. And maybe that's one of the reasons why Lynn Townsend was so open to changing out Exner, because he saw some of these clays and just thought, this isn't going to cut it in the marketplace, and we need something new. In any case, new is what they got for 1965 in a number of ways. The Chryslers that were introduced for that model year were larger. They rode atop a 123.5-inch wheelbase, except for station wagons that rode atop 121.5 inches. And the overall length was around 218 inches. Now, recall at this point that Chrysler had an interesting philosophy compared to others in this medium to upper price class, and that was that they were not going to make smaller cars. Recall that in 1961, GM's Buick and Oldsmobile, as well as Pontiac, had introduced their senior compacts, smaller vehicles, the Tempest for Pontiac, the F-85 for Olds, and the Buick Special or Skylark. And Chrysler just simply wasn't going to do that. They had a philosophy that as opposed to making their cars smaller, they would potentially take them down in price. So you could get, as an example, a Newport as opposed to a New Yorker. But they were not going to make these any smaller. And beyond the cars themselves just being physically large, Engel's team executed a number of styling cues on these cars to really accentuate the overall length as well as the width. Take a look here at the side section of one of these New Yorkers, and you can see that the belt line is pretty much flat, but it does gently taper off toward the rear, kind of giving you that look of length overall in the side view. And beyond the belt line, you also have this feature line that's got a pretty prominent radius on the lower portion of the body. Now, the beautiful piece about this side section is that if you rotate around to the front or rear three-quarter view, for instance, you notice that this isn't just a flat plane, but in fact, the sheet metal kind of goes out, in, out, in, out, in, all the way down the body side. And it gives it some sense of overall dimension, and I think, frankly, makes it one of the best-looking Chryslers from this view. The car was also made to look even longer by adding this bright molding on the top of the fenders as well as the door and rear quarter panel that drew your eye across the car. And it frankly worked, I think, quite well. Now, perhaps one of the most interesting details on the front end was actually these tempered glass lenses that were in front of the headlights as well as the bright lights on these vehicles. And they had horizontal lines on them just to give it a bit of flair. So Chrysler was doing something, or at least trying to do something here. Remember, at this point, the U.S. was really mandating sealed beam headlights. You couldn't have composite headlamps or anything that wasn't a sealed beam up front. But Chrysler effectively predated the 1984 Mark VII as being a vehicle that was trying to do something different with the headlights and kind of making these into almost a composite-like look when in fact they still had to use the sealed beams. Now, another interesting tidbit about those horizontal lines is that engineers at Chrysler actually made the designers change the lines so that they couldn't go across the headlamp beams themselves. So you notice in this picture that the lines stop anywhere outside of those headlamp beams. And these are not movable tempered glass pieces. These are not headlight doors that move up and down. You would just have to remove them if you wanted to change a headlight bulb, for instance. Now, while it looked cool, you can imagine that these glass pieces in front of the headlamps actually caused a number of problems in the field, in addition to just costing money. For instance, condensation would get between the headlight and that piece of glass, and then that would scatter the light, making them less effective. Or in some cases, because the glass was flat and it wasn't getting as hot from the headlights as the headlights were themselves, snow would stick to it when customers were driving and then wouldn't melt off as easily as if the snow had just come in contact with a hot sealed beam bulb. So in general, it wasn't a great design in practice. And as a consequence, it was eliminated after the 1965 model year, but it looked pretty sweet. And beyond the cool headlamp details, the bumpers on the 65 Chryslers, the front bumper is super cool, kind of continues that front fender form, and I think it's a super handsome look overall. And of course, the designers then mimicked that theme in the rear, again, having that bumper continue the rear quarter panel form. Now, another interesting thing about the rear styling of these, as opposed to just being tasteful with this flat deck lid that Elwood Engel liked, was that for part of the model year, the New Yorkers had clear lenses for the taillights. So it effectively looked like the concave aluminum panel that was in the middle of that tail section just kind of continued on to the outsides of the body. It was a super, super handsome look. And Chrysler, as a consequence, had to have small inner red lenses capping the bulbs in order for them to flash red from the rear. You can imagine that this was not easy to manufacture. the scrap rate was high, and so partway through the model year, Chrysler changed to red lenses on these New Yorkers. Of course, you could get your 65 Chrysler in many different body styles, but perhaps most interesting was a body style that returned to Chrysler for the first time since 1959, and that was the six-window town sedan. That was a pillared sedan, but you can see here it has this rear quarter glass, and I think that gives this car kind of a unique feel that I would say is even better than the coupes because the roof just looks much more airy. The coupes had a very chunky C-pillar, as you can see here. But if you got one of these six-window four-doors, you have this kind of light roof-looking design, and I think it just complements the overall look of the vehicle in total. In fact, it was really the designer's desire to only have that six-window as the four-door of choice. You couldn't get any other four-door. That was their proposal. But concerns about its cost really led Chrysler to produce a four-window sedan with a wide C-pillar. And I just don't think that particular variant looks as good as the six-window. But you put in the comments section what you think. Turning to the inside, Chrysler's had an all-new interior for 1965, and there were a few new features and some that I guess were sacrilege, I would think, to many Mopar fans. The first thing to notice here is that there's something missing, especially if you were a Mopar fan from the 50s or 60s. Can you guess what it is? There's no push-button torque flight buttons on the instrument panel. There's a column shifter. What in the world is Chrysler doing? That's right. For 1965, Chrysler returned to the column shifter and eschewed those torque flight buttons. So I guess some people liked it, some didn't like it and missed their buttons to push like a typewriter in order to shift the gear. But they were gone for 1965, and Chrysler also reintroduced a Astrodome-style instrument panel. Recall the Astrodome of the early 1960s was one of the most beautiful dashes ever found in any car. And here Chrysler executed a similar design on the interior of their 65 vehicles, although it doesn't quite have that three-dimensionality that the previous Astrodome instrument panel had. Oh well, it's still relatively tasteful. And while it didn't have exactly the great look of the 60 to 62 Astrodome instrument panel, you did get a few little handy-dandy doodads in the interior of your Chrysler, like a coin holder, a tissue dispenser, and even some rather crude cup holders. So you did get a few things that the 60 to 62 did not have. Under hood in your New Yorker, you got a gem of an engine as well as transmission. More specifically, the standard engine in these was a 340 horsepower, 413 cubic inch V8. Optional was what Chrysler called the Scorcher, the 360 horsepower, 413 cubic inch V8, both with 10.1 to 1 compression ratios and both propelling these vehicles with a fair amount of scoot. Of course, underneath your Chrysler, you still had unibody suspension. So the torsion bars up front, the leaf springs in the rear, similar to what Chrysler had been employing for a number of years. So the key question then is that did this pivot in styling direction really work for Chrysler? Was it successful? And I think the answer is pretty much an unqualified yes. Calendar year production for Chrysler, all of the Chryslers, totaled 224,000 units in 1965. That was a 50% increase over 1964 and even surpassing Chrysler's previous all-time high that was set in 1955 by about 25%. Now, I guess the one question that you have to look at is, was some of this taking away from the success of other divisions? And perhaps that's true, especially as Chrysler did end up pushing into the lower market with their Newport as an example. And even the 300 became kind of a debased trim unless you got a letter car like a 300L during this time period. But still, 225,000 units in a record sales year, I would call that a success. So what can you expect if you own one of these mid-60s Chryslers? Well, I'll say a few things about them. The 413 and the Torque Flight Automatic are just awesome engines and transmissions, flawless, peppy, awesome, great torque curves, great power. I would call them just faultless engines and transmissions during this time period. The suspension system, it depends what you're looking for. These big Chryslers do actually handle quite well compared to, in particular, the Fords that were being produced at the same time. GM cars handled relatively well, but I'd say that the Chryslers even have a leg up there. And they do have stiffer suspensions. The torsion bar up front and the leaf spring rear do endow the cars with a little bit more jittery and bumpy ride. And the unibody doesn't give it quite the isolation that the GM and Ford cars had of the era. So these cars are a little bit noisier on the inside and can kind of sound a little bit more tinny, if you will. I will say that Chrysler did try to stem some of the downsides with respect to its unibody for the 1965 model year. As an example, take a look at this picture here. This is a picture of the rear shock mounting. You'll notice that it's mounted to a rear cross member as opposed to being mounted to the floor pan directly. And this allowed the rear shock to not necessarily transmit as much vibration into the interior of the car as it did in previous model years. It kind of was pretty ingenious, actually. So when the wheel goes up and down, the shock is clearly mounted to that rear cross member and bolted to it. So the vibration's really going to mostly happen in that cross member itself and be somewhat dampened before it gets to the floor pan. But I would say that they're still quite pleasant overall, and the interior materials in the New Yorker in particular, as an example, were excellent. The fit and finish on these cars, wasn't all that great, but I think they look great, and they do drive quite well overall. Even the steering gear in these is pretty good. So if you find one, you're going to really enjoy it, in particular the 413 and TorqueFlite combination. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on Chrysler's 1965 New Yorker. And by the way, find one with the translucent taillights as opposed to one with the red taillights out back. I think that's a super cool design detail, although it's pretty hard probably to find now since that was only produced for half of the model year.